Welcome back to the InvestTalk Sector Spotlight. I'm Justin Klein.
I'm Luke Guerrero.
And today we're going to talk about the energy sector. And the energy sector is very volatile, especially over the past couple of years with COVID and the war in Ukraine. And so there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of pitfalls as well. There's obviously the oil part of the energy sector, the natural gas part, which is related in some ways, but also different. And there's also kind of the old yet somewhat new parts of the alternative space, which would be uranium and coal, which we're going to get to. But let's start off with oil and natural gas. That is the bread and butter of our energy use throughout the global economy. So the big question is, in this new environment where Russia's been cut off from the global energy and financial system, do we think that energy is going to be a good place to invest going forward?
I think so. I mean, if you look at what primarily drives returns, it's demand and commodity prices, right? So we're in a situation right now where demand is pretty loose. And in the future, it's probably going to be a lot better, right? When we get out of what could be a mild recession, though a lot of people, including myself, don't believe it's going to be that prolonged. And you're in a situation where commodity prices are really low. Right. So this seems to me like we are near as low as the valuations could possibly be of energy companies.
Yeah. I mean, unless energy prices just continue much, much lower. But if you look at the supply demand dynamics within the industry, it's pretty tight, right?
No, it's really tight.
The inventories are very tight. And there's been a lot of speculation of, once again, a recession, the big R word. And in a recession, demand for energy typically does slow down, but it takes a really, really bad recession for the demand for energy more broadly to actually shrink. In 2008, it did shrink, but that took that took a global financial crisis for the demand for energy to fall just a little bit. And so if you, as you say, have a mild recession that's probably not going to last very long, energy demand continues to go up. And then most people focus on the demand side, but the supply side is just as important. And there's been this cycle, there's capital cycles, and there's been under investment within the energy space for new production. And part of that is just simply because more money's flowing towards tech names, right? More of those exciting investments, and your kind of bread and butter energy investment has kind of been taken for granted. And so you've kind of seen a big shift within the industry over the past few years of just not really investing the same way they used to.
Yeah, for Europe, they chose a strange bedfellow in Russia, right? A lot of their supply comes from Russia. For the United States, that was really never the case, right? Yeah. A lot of the global supply for us comes from internally or through OPEC, right? Through the non-Russian partners in the Middle East, right? Saudi Arabia, countries like that.
Or Canada, right?
Or Canada. Right. Canada, you don't even have to go that far. So, a lot of people thought that what was driving energy prices up in the United States, right at home, was the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But really, it has more to do with what OPEC has been doing on the supply side over the past year. And what did they do at the last meeting, right? They said they're going to cut back on their production going forward. There's some speculation that they might do that again at this next upcoming meeting, where, I don't know if you heard this, they actually banned journalists from Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, maybe because they're scared that they're going to get the news that they're going to cut back even more a little early before they announce it. But I think that in terms of where they're moving in the supply and contracting the supply, and where you expect 6, 7, 9, 8, 9 months out demand to be, I think that it's probably a good place to be.
Yeah. And I think the biggest story within the oil and gas space is the incentive structures within these corporations. For many years in the start of the shale boom, these CEOs and C-suites were incentivized to grow production, right? To drill more wells and get more barrels out of the ground. And what happened was that was a ton of misallocation of capital, kept those prices low, which means the return on those investments were, in a lot of cases, negative, because the cost to drill shale is a lot higher than your typical traditional well. So what's happened lately over the past few years is a shift towards, hey, what about return of capital to shareholders, dividends, stock buybacks? And was it Charlie Munger that always says, like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome? And
if it's a great quote, it's always Charlie Munger.
Exactly. Right. So I think this is a perfect example of, in real world, what happens when you build this incentive structure that takes the eye off the ball of actually making good, sound investments for shareholders and the manifestation of that. And now you almost have the inverse. And so I do think it is a good place to be finding great values. And many of them are still trading at 3, 4, 5 times enterprise value to EBITDA, which for everyone out there, that's a pretty low valuation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So as long as they can maintain a semblance of the recent earnings trends, I think a lot of them are going to return a ton of capital to shareholders. Many of them paid down debts, bought back shares, et cetera. And so that's a very enticing thing to invest in, a company that's doing those smart things for shareholders, not destroying capital as they did in the early shale era, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people though have been talking about what might compress demand a little bit is a shift towards renewable energy over the next decade. So, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's certainly a worry there, but the history of human civilization says that once they discover a new form of energy, right? It used to be wood, and then it was whale oil, and then
whale oil.
Yeah, whale oil. Yeah.
When did they use whale oil?
In the 1800s, to light lamps.
You learn something new every day.
There you go. Yeah, that's why whales almost went extinct. Right?
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. There you go. So, but they've
before my time.
Yeah. But they've it was right in my time exactly. But basically, humans have never stopped using a particular type of energy. They choose more of that new type. And so what you've seen is EVs are getting adoption. And I think last month, or I think it was March was the last data that I read, EVs were about 7 to 8% of global car sales, which is not nothing anymore, right? No. It's not the 1 to 2% that was for a long time, but it's fairly significant. But is that crimping demand? No, because what's happening in the emerging markets, there's still demand growth and they don't have the money to buy a $100,000 EV, right?
That's an excellent point, right? You have the primary offenders, if you will, if you look at it that way, in terms of who is burning fossil fuels, and it's large countries such as the United States and first world countries. But even if they can shift towards renewable energy, that's expensive, right? You're reworking the entire grid, pretty much, the electrical grid. Most of the electricity in the United States is still created by coal, right? It's coal-powered plants. But countries that don't necessarily have that ability are not going to be able to make that shift.
Yeah. And so they're going to increasingly still use internal combustion engines, gasoline, and normal energy that comes from carbon in some way, right? And so that's a good shift to coal and uranium, which I think are the two kind of subsectors of the energy space that are not talked about nearly enough. Obviously, coal in a lot of ways is dying because they're finding better alternatives, right? Alternative energy to that, much cleaner. Natural gas used to be the clean version of
Do you remember
coal.
when clean coal was a thing? When they were pushing clean coal? Yeah, that didn't work out very well.
Yeah, it didn't work out very well. But I think uranium is one that definitely has some traction. You're starting to see the EU say that nuclear power is green.
Not Germany, though.
Right?
Germany's been pulling back from their nuclear
Germany
power.
is not, but the EU as a whole, right? And even in the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US, there were some credits or some incentives to build nuclear plants. So I think that is an area where if it's taken 25, 30 years for the global energy sector to clean energy sector to be about 20% of global energy production. And it's just going to be very difficult to reach any green objectives without using and expanding nuclear in some way. Maybe that's small modular reactors. Maybe it's your traditional large reactors. But I think it's becoming more and more obvious that you can't just rely on on green energy to take over the mantle in any reasonable time frame. And it's not good baseload power, right?
Yeah.
There's renewable energy is all about the wind and the sun and whether or not that's shining or it's blowing. And if it's not, then you're in tough waters. But nuclear, it's a good base load power that doesn't spew 1 ounce of carbon. So I think that's an area that
spews some other things, though. It can potentially spew some other things.
Yes.
Do you know the story of why we use uranium and plutonium for reactors?
I don't remember it.
So yeah, it was actually I think it was the Nixon administration when we first started going with nuclear power. There was a choice to be made, and I think France actually chose the opposite, which is thorium reactors, right? And thorium reactors have a half-life of maybe 200 years, right? When the decayed substance that comes from that reactor, whereas plutonium and uranium, it's in the tens of thousands of years, right? So that's the primary reason why people don't like reactor or nuclear energy, is because of the byproduct, the waste. But you have to remember where we were in the Nixon administration, which Cold War, exactly. And thorium doesn't produce weapons grade uranium or plutonium. So when we created the infrastructure for nuclear energy in the United States, we had that in mind. So maybe going forward, given that we're kind of in a new world where pretty much everyone who needs to have nukes has nukes at this point, and we're not really racing to make more, it could be the case that when we do reinvest in that type of nuclear technology, that we do so in a more clean way.
That's an interesting take. And I did remember that story. I didn't remember exactly where you're leading, but yeah, that's true. And it just shows you how government action can certainly shape different industries. And so I think that was a good overview of where we are at in the energy space. And I appreciate you all for tuning in. And if you want to learn more about the energy sector or all the different sectors that we discussed on InvestTalk, don't hesitate to head over to InvestTalk and like and subscribe, and give our listener line a call at 888-99-CHART.